I must confess that I never actually saw Nibbler in the arcades. I have of course seen its many descendants, as have you in all likelihood. The game has been cloned many times through the years, most recently appearing as a common built-in on mobile phones. The premise is always the same. You control a snake that slithers around a maze, eating food that causes it to grow longer, increasing the danger that you'll lose a life by having the snake collide with itself. Many years before I would ever own a cell phone, though, I read about Nibbler in a video game magazine, sitting beside the swimming pool of my parents' winter retreat in Florida. I used to read all of what I see now as the first generation of video game magazines. A key point of these was that their writers and editors had not grown up surrounded by video games. They were approaching them as novelties discovered in adulthood, and their writing reflected this. I find the game journalism of today inescapably entrenched in its own lingo, with years of tradition inside an internet-accelerated gaming culture. The video game reviewers of 22 years ago, on the other hand, were necessarily trailblazers, creating game journalism as they went by experimentally borrowing from the language of other subjects, such as film or literary reviews, and always writing for an audience like themselves, grown up, albeit keenly interested in a very playful pastime. It was all quite eclectic, and for a little kid who loved both video games and reading, it was wonderful, even if most of the baby boomer cultural references went over my head. Nibbler appeared in this one particular article because some guy had set a world record by scoring 1 billion points in it. Literally, 1 billion points. It was a big deal. The article only described the game itself as a bare sketch and spent more time letting this fellow talk about his napping and bathroom strategies during the marathon session. If you play a little bit of Nibbler, it's not hard to see how a dedicated soul could decide to make a 10-digit run at it. The game, as presented in its original form, is rather odd for being unabashedly deterministic. There are only a handful of pre-designed mazes, with the dots in the same places every time. It allowed players with good memories and better reflexes to learn the patterns in little time, and then effectively play for as long as they liked. The fact that you got an extra guy every 4 boards helped offset the occasional slip-up, and that's just what this guy did, taking a breather every time he'd racked up a couple of hundred lives or so. I'd encounter Nibbler again in an Atari computer magazine years later while I was in high school. These magazines invariably had code for you to type in the back, and once I typed in a game which I think was called The Worms of Bremen or something like that. Anyway, there it was, Nibbler again, or at least a passable clone of same. It was pretty fun, worth the effort of all that typing, I thought. I have no idea how many lines of code I hammered in during those years, and while I suppose I did wonder how it all worked inside the computer, I don't think it taught me the first thing about programming. The code lacked comments in order to pack as much on the page as possible, so I had no idea what all the crazy stuff meant. Now, it's true that I would eventually become a professional programmer anyway, but I didn't really start to learn that craft until college. Years before I learned to code, I started learning how to write, and that is what I got out of these years of reading early video game and later computer magazines. At the time, the Nibbler story was a fluff piece in a doomed magazine. The mid-1980s video game crash had just happened, and all the magazines specializing in games were moribund. But the subject matter kept me interested, while the style and vocabulary worked their way deep in, laying the foundations for a life of writing. And that is why, decades later, I encountered a software-emulated arcade game I hadn't seen before but still recognized almost immediately, recalling all at once the time I read about the billion-point game so long ago.
This has been another installment of Jmac's Arcade. For more information, show archives, or to subscribe, visit arcade.jmac.org. Play Volity games at volity.net.